Hi there, and welcome to the first part of your overview lecture on our unit in American imperialism. There are actually two parts to this lecture. The first part here will talk about the reasons why the United States starts to act in an imperialistic manner, and the second part will deal with what we're actually doing, where we're acting imperialistically. So hopefully you have your notes ready to go, and let's get started. The United States exiting the Civil War, entering a period of industrialization, isn't actually very imperialistic. We had always had enough territory to go around. If you remember from this map here, we kind of start on the East Coast with the 13 colonies, and there's this ability to continue pushing west, right? Louisiana Purchase, the territory we gained from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. Nor had there ever been a real desire to be imperialistic or to gain outside territory that wasn't contiguous, that wasn't part of or next to territory we already held. Our Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, always focused on the ability of self-rule, to choose a government, to have a voice in that government, and acting imperialistically kind of went against that. So right around the mid-1800s, not a lot of desire to push outwards. Now, there is kind of an inkling against that, kind of an exception to the rule, and that is gaining the territory of Alaska. It won't become a state. That doesn't happen until after World War II. But in 1867, Secretary of State William Seward does purchase the territory from Russia, who was consolidating at that point. And he gets a really amazing deal for it, 2 cents per acre. A lot of people thought this was foolish. They called it Seward's icebox or Seward's folly, thought he was crazy. In the end, he turns out to be right. Alaska really is quite resource rich. But at the time, everybody thought he was kind of kooky and okay, if there's trees there, great, and that was it. Nobody put any great thought into it. Nobody saw it as the beginning of anything more than that. But as we approach the turn of the century, that's going to change. And that starts kind of from the outside with what's going on with European nations. About the mid-1890s, Africa turns into this map here. It's not the map we're used to seeing. It shows us the territorial holdings of different nations in Europe. So all the blue is France. All the red is the United Kingdom, the Empire of Great Britain. These European nations have gone in, conquered, and are holding these territories as colonies. They are using these colonies, these territories, to harvest natural resources, timber, rubber, foodstuffs like peanuts. But also they are using them as markets to sell the goods that they are manufacturing in their home or mother countries. So steel that's being produced in England is being shipped to the southern part of Africa, sold to be used in construction there. The United States, both government officials and major power players in the business world are looking at this and saying, whoa, if Africa just disappeared, what are we doing? What should we be doing? So the attitudes towards imperialism start to change. The United States, in the sense of those in government and those in business, start to feel that imperialism is a route that should be taken. The reasonings they start to give for why the United States should act in an imperial way fall into 3 main categories: economic, military, and cultural. We're going to look very briefly at each of those 3. The first being economic, primarily the fear of competition. We just looked at what happened to Africa. The United States is fearful that if that large continent just totally got gobbled up, what is the United States missing out on? Not just the raw materials, but also the ability to sell their goods elsewhere. There's also this kind of extreme fear that if the United States doesn't get in on this game, so to speak, that the United States could possibly somewhere down the road become an acquisition itself. And the example here that everyone's pointing to is China. If we look at this cartoon, we see that China is being divided up. We kind of see a China pie. And all the other major global leaders, so we see Queen Victoria of Great Britain there on the far left, followed by Germany, Russia, France, and Japan. Everyone's deciding what part of China they want. The United States fears that if they don't become active in this game, that could be them, that these other world players could start crouching on American territory. So the United States begins to say, hey, we're really dependent on these outside sources of raw materials. We're also dependent on these outside markets. We need to make sure that these things are secure, that we are getting the same piece of the whole global trade pie, particularly in oil and foodstuffs. The United States at this point in history is producing so much raw petroleum that we're not only able to meet our own needs, but to ship half of it overseas. And we're a huge producer of corn and wheat, among other foodstuffs. And we want to make sure that the markets we've secured not only stay in place, but hopefully that we can expand as well. People in the government have a strong understanding that the government and the economy, the wealth of the nation are very, very tightly linked, and they want to make sure that that stays secure. At the same time, we have the publication of this book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. What Mahan did was he went back into history and asked himself what made nations successful, what made nations unsuccessful. And his conclusion, his theory, was that nations that had a strong naval presence, especially in terms of military naval presence, were nations that were successful, that thrived, that grew. So he makes this argument that is taken up by numerous persons in the United States government that we need to build up our naval power, not just to protect and defend our own borders, but to defend and protect our merchant ships as well. Now, the problem is at this point in history, ships, especially naval ships, are run on coal creating steam. You can only have so much coal in a boat that takes up so much room to have room for your cargo so that a trip is profitable. So you need to have these refueling stations along the way, especially if you're going across the Pacific Ocean to China and Japan, at the time were the Dutch East Indies, where you have these incredibly long journeys that could be more profitable if you could stop along the way and get coal as you went versus trying to take all the necessary coal with you. So his argument becomes a prominent one in growing American territory in order that we can set up these coaling stations, these military defense posts throughout the kind of global seas so that we can protect our economic interests abroad. And finally, while this is going on, we have these cultural reasons that come along as kind of the top layer of everything else. There's a lot of pseudoscience that's going around at this point in history saying that the white race is actually superior to all the other races. In particular, the darker a race is, the less quote-unquote civilized they are. Now we know that that's totally bunk, it's totally false, but at the time a lot of people believed this. And the idea was that if the white race is superior, then it is the white man's burden, his job, his duty to help these other races try and uplift themselves out of the darkness that they were in. Again, totally false. We see that as really kind of just silly today, stupid, but it was held at the time. And a great illustration of this is this cartoon. We see Uncle Sam, very identifiable in his striped trousers here, and the stars, and also Great Britain. And both of these men are carrying baskets with these other peoples who each represent a nation. Now, obviously, these other peoples are drawn in a horribly racist caricature, but the point here that this artist was making is that these people were seen as incapable of carrying themselves over these rocks, and these rocks were symbols of different things. For instance, ignorance, vice, brutality, superstition. That it was our duty to carry them up this mountain of civilization because they would never be able to do this for themselves. So it kind of became this justification of, well, if we go in and take care of economic interests there, set up markets, buy raw materials or control raw materials, then we have the ability to help these people, quote unquote, be better. And so that will kind of become the third reason why we see the United States starting to act in an imperialist manner. So just as a recap before we wrap up this lesson, the United States following the Civil War really didn't have any interest in gaining territory outside of its continental borders, its two oceans. But as we enter the industrial age and as Europe becomes more imperialistic and starts gaining these territorial holdings, especially in Africa, major players in the United States decide that maybe the United States should be also acting that way. And they come up with three sets of reasons why they should do that: economic, military, and cultural. Hopefully your notes are complete, and when you're ready, just click on presentation 2.